Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. The biggest story today is that Moscow's carefully managed image of strength is getting roughed up in public, at home, and in front of the international crowd it still wants to impress. The St. Petersburg International Economic Forum opened on June 3rd as Putin's flagship economic stage, the place where Russia tries to say, sanctions? What sanctions? But the broader scene around the forum told a much messier story. Deep economic strain, elite anxiety, wartime overreach, and a Russia that increasingly has to perform confidence while patching holes behind the curtain. An update on the St. Petersburg thread. Ukraine's strike on the city and nearby Kronstadt was important not just because something blew up, but because of where and when it happened. This was Putin's hometown during his premier economic showcase. Ukrainian officials said they hit the St. Petersburg oil terminal and military targets at Kronstadt, including the Baltic Fleet corvette Boyki. Pulkovo Airport stopped operations for several hours. Smoke was visible from the city's western edge, and Russian officials had to explain why the war they promised would stay far away was suddenly making a cameo at the Russian Davos. Not exactly the glossy brochure Moscow ordered. The symbolism cuts deeper because SPIEF is no longer the elite global business magnate it once was. Before the full-scale invasion, Western executives and major energy deals gave the forum a real international sheen. This year's guest of honor was Saudi Arabia, and the only world leaders expected were from Uzbekistan and Tanzania. The U.S. presence was led by Rodney Mims Cook Jr., chairman of the Commission of Fine Arts, while Candace Owens appeared on the program. That lineup tells you something. Russia is still hosting the party, but the guest list has changed. The forum also produced a revealing bit of Russian political theater. Konstantin Malafeev and Alexander Dugin presented extreme future scenarios for Russia, including the occupation of Kiev, Odessa, and Kharkiv, the collapse of the European Union, and even nuclear use if the war continues along its current path. That's not policy guidance so much as imperial fan fiction with PowerPoint formatting. But it matters because the Kremlin has to manage these hardline voices without letting them box Putin into impossible promises. The ultranationalists want total victory. The battlefield and the budget keep refusing to RSVP. That brings us to the economic pressure. Russia's finance ministry said it would sharply increase purchases of foreign currency and gold between June 5th and July 6th to rebuild the National Wealth Fund and ease pressure from a strong ruble. The headline number is 208.2 billion rubles, or about $2.8 billion. Higher oil prices helped, with Russian export prices reportedly reaching levels not seen since 2014. But here's the catch. The windfall was smaller than some analysts expected because production and refinery output have been hit. So yes, Moscow is still taking in energy money, but the machine is getting less smooth, and the cost of keeping the war economy humming keeps climbing. There was also an odd absence at SPIEF. Central Bank Governor Elvira Nabiullina did not attend, officially because of sick leave, though Russian reporting also pointed to the funeral of her advisor Alexei Mogin. Whatever the reason, her absence stood out because Russian financial officials were simultaneously declaring absolute financial sovereignty and insisting Russia must stop expecting sanctions relief. That is a very Russian wartime vibe. Big, confident language on stage, complicated reality just off stage. Energy and sanctions enforcement remain another pressure point. Putin signed an order allowing France's Total Energies to sell its 10% stake in Arctic LNG-2 to a Novatek-linked buyer. The project has been under U.S. sanctions since late 2023, and Total Energies had already written down billions in losses after the invasion. Meanwhile, France released the Russian captain of the sanctioned tanker Tagor after questioning, though the ship remained under investigation. The larger issue is Europe's struggle to police Russia's shadow fleet. Western governments want to disrupt these ships, but maritime law makes long-term detention and confiscation tricky. Moscow knows that and keeps pushing through the gray zone like it bought a season pass. Diplomatically, Ukraine got a meaningful opening in Europe. Hungary lifted its block on opening formal EU accession talks after Kyiv and Budapest reached an agreement on expanding rights for Ukraine's ethnic Hungarian community. That does not mean Ukraine gets a fast lane. Prime Minister Peter Magyar said Hungary still opposes shortcuts and floated a 10 to 15-year accession timeline, plus a legally binding referendum. Still, for Kyiv, opening the door matters. NATO remains politically blocked, so the EU path is becoming a major strategic anchor. Germany, meanwhile, took a hit at the United Nations. Berlin failed to win a rotating seat on the Security Council, losing out to Portugal and Austria. Foreign Minister Johann Vadeful called it a bitter defeat and said Germany's support for Ukraine and its position on Israel may have cost votes. He also accused Russia of stirring opposition. That is worth noting because Russia's influence campaign is not limited to tanks, drones, or telegram channels. It is also grinding away in the diplomatic middle ground, where votes from the global south and smaller states can still shape outcomes. Armenia is another arena where the geopolitical contest is getting spicy. This is an update on a continuing story, but the new details are important. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stopped in Yerevan on May 26th and signed a strategic partnership charter, a transit corridor framework tied to the Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity, and a critical minerals agreement. 2 days later, President Trump publicly endorsed Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan ahead of Armenia's June 7th parliamentary elections. Russia, predictably, is not loving this plot twist. Moscow is warning about Western influence, pushing narratives around the Russian Orthodox Church and leaning into information operations. Researchers cited a large AI-driven Matryoshka campaign with hundreds of fabricated videos. The election is formally domestic, but the real question is Armenia's strategic direction. NATO's eastern flank is also feeling the war's spillover in concrete ways. Romania detonated a Russian Yarem-type anti-landing mine that washed up on its Black Sea coast between Vama Veche and Tumai. Separately, after a Russian-made drone crashed into a residential building in Galatai and wounded 2 civilians, Romania said allies are preparing to reinforce air defenses. The list includes radar coverage, air policing, fighter aircraft, and anti-drone systems. France, Britain, Italy, Spain, and potentially the U.S. are all part of the conversation. The message is simple. Russia may not have intended every spillover incident, but NATO territory keeps getting touched by Russia's war. Inside Russia, the domestic security atmosphere is tightening. The Max Messenger, Moscow's preferred state-friendly platform, disappeared from the App Store after Cloudflare had previously labeled it spyware. That is awkward for a government trying to herd citizens away from Western platforms and into a controlled domestic ecosystem. At the same time, Russian authorities reported new espionage and treason cases in Sevastopol, Khabarovsk, and Volgograd, including claims involving Ukrainian intelligence, SIM cards, and information on Russian forces. Some of these are state claims that should be treated carefully, but the pattern is unmistakable. The security services are widening the net as the war comes home. The military picture supports the larger strategic story without needing to drown in map details. Russian ground progress remains limited, especially around Lyman and the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk axis, where attempts to create pressure through infiltration and encirclement have not produced a breakthrough. Analysts say Russia's weak battlefield momentum is one reason Moscow is escalating air attacks on Ukrainian cities. Ukraine, meanwhile, is trying to build future leverage through domestic industry. Firepoint says it tested the FP7.X missile, intended as the basis for the future Freya anti-ballistic interceptor. That matters because Kyiv needs alternatives to scarce Patriot interceptors. Thanks for listening and being part of this community. If you're finding value here, a review, comment, or share helps more people stay informed. We also publish a daily intel brief on Substack at restrictedhandling.substack.com, where we go deeper on Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Have a great day. Prosody.